we'll have this discussion about like OpenAPI specification. Yes, but which one? So we will have Arnaud Lauret on stage talking to us about like OpenAPI 3 does what Swagger 2 doesn't. Like, actually, is the word Swagger still allowed to pronounce, Arnaud?
No, you have to put 10 euros in the Swagger jar.
Yeah, the Swagger jar. So yeah, and where the money of the Swagger jar goes.
To any charity you want.
Yeah. Okay. So so now I have a hard time. So if I pronounce it, I don't push for the last name, the OpenAPI specification. But if I pronounce it, I give it to charity. It's really hard now. So yeah, Arnaud. Yeah, the stage is yours for 25 minutes, 20 plus 5. Yeah. Wow. And I already see some awesome slides there.
Thank you. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm happy to be here with you today. I'm Arnaud Lauret, also known as API Handyman on Twitter, and that's also the name of my blog. I work at Postman in the Open Technology team as the OpenAPI tech lead. The Open Technology team aims to educate people around APIs, specification, and so on. I also wrote a book called The Design of Web APIs, which is obviously about the design of web APIs. And it has been translated from English to Japanese, Korean, and Russian. Just a few seconds about the reference behind this session for those who are not as old as me. In the 90s, there was a rivalry between Sega and Nintendo, and in America, Sega of America launched a series of advertisements. Genesis, the Sega Genesis, does what Nintendo don't, to bash a little bit their adversary. So let's see if that's the case with OpenAPI and Swagger. Let's talk about the history. Where does Swagger and OpenAPI come from? So in 2011, the team that was working on the WordNik Online Dictionary was struggling with generating SDKs and API documentation. So to solve that problem, they created a suite of libraries and tools that they called Swagger, that was most known for the UI that was used for rendering the API documentation, which was called Swagger UI. This UI was powered by a JSON document, which was not really important at that time. In 2014, Swagger 2 was released. So there was the new Swagger UI, a new Swagger editor, that put the Swagger 2 specification up to the prompt. That's the moment I actually discovered the specification. In 2015, the Swagger 2 specification, thanks to some brilliant mind, was donated to an organization that was under the Linux Foundation, and this organization was called, and this is still called, the OpenAPI Initiative. And so the OpenAPI specification was born. The Swagger brand and the tools stayed the propriety of SmartBear. So it's actually not Swagger versus OpenAPI. It's about Swagger then OpenAPI, because there was Swagger 3, and now the Swagger 2, sorry, and now there is OpenAPI 3. So OpenAPI is just the new version of Swagger. Nowadays, there are two versions of OpenAPI 3 which are available. The 3.0, which was released in July 2017, and the 3.1, which was released on February last year. Nowadays, tools usually support version 2, version 3.0, and they start to support version 3.1. And so yes, OpenAPI 3 is the new version of Swagger 2, which was a great specification, and OpenAPI 3 make it even great. It improves the structure, the way you describe hosting, security, how you describe the interface contract, and documentation. So let's take a look at all those improvements. First, structural modification. In a Swagger 2 document, the version of the specification used was indicated by a Swagger property. it has to be changed into an OpenAPI property. By the way, when you create a specification, whatever it is, it's a very good idea to put the version of the spec inside the document. That way, the work of parsing documents will be easier for people creating tools. And also, when you find a document, you know in which version of the spec it is. Not to confound with the version of the API, which is in the info.version property. The main modification in the structure of a document, which has been brought by OpenAPI 3, is a better separation between what was reusable across the document and what was just a definition, especially at the root level. In Swagger 2 document, you have, for instance, the parameters property, which is at the root of the document. Many people were thinking that all parameters defined at this level were applied to all operations of the API, which was not the case. The parameters at the root of the Swagger 2 document are reusable parameters that you can use in any operation. So all reusable components are now in a dedicated section, which is called components. This is where you will find the definitions, which are now renamed schemas, the values data model you can use across the API, and parameters, and many other things. One thing that brought OpenAPI 3 is a modification that allows to have better consistency across all you describe in OpenAPI document. Because now in OpenAPI 3, all piece of data is defined in the same way. In Swagger 2, there were two ways of defining data. The one that was used for request and response bodies, a kind of subset of JSON schema. And for parameters and headers, it was kind of JSON schema, but you could not take advantage of reusable schema definition. All this is forgotten, and now in OpenAPI 3 and 3.1, you can define data models in component schemas. For example, a resource ID, which is used in parameter or in response of a request. And so you can use this schema in parameters, in headers, in request bodies, and in response bodies. So you define it once, and you use it anywhere. And so that ensures a certain level of consistency in your API definitions, and also that simplify the API designer's jobs or anyone jobs who is to actually write OpenAPI definition. With OpenAPI 3, we have more reusable components, especially examples. I will come to that later, and headers. Regarding where your API is hosted, in Swagger 2, you had at the root level 3 properties: schemes, host, and base path, which allow you to define where your API is exposed, but you can define a single point of exposition. In OpenAPI 3, you can define as many points of exposition you want, one too many, which is interesting. For example, you could have a production server, a mock server, or qualification server, or whatever. You can also take advantage of variables when you define your server. So here I have a single server, which can be a mock server or the real server. And all these possibilities are really wonderful, for instance, when you want to configure an API gateway. Because in your document, you can put the server for the backend, the server or the front end, which will be shown outside of the gateway, and the gateway will deal with that. Another area which has been enhanced is security. So there are no big structural change on this part. Just security definition, which was at the root level, is moved to inside components as security schemes. But the existing security schemes have been upgraded. So for instance, basic authentication is replaced by HTTP, which proposed basic authentication and authentication with a bearer token. API key is not modified. OAuth2 security definition has been slightly fixed, using names that are more directly related to the different flows that actually exist. and there were some URL that were missing, that were added. New in 3 also, the possibility of secure your API with OpenID Connect. And in 3.1, you can tell that your API is secured with mutual TLS, which is a way of securing API that is often used in corporate environments. And again, all that will simplify the way you can configure the exposition of your API on API gateways. Let's talk about data now. Actually, we could do several sessions about the improvements regarding the definition of data in OpenAPI 3. I only have 20 minutes, so I will try to focus on the main elements. The first one is with OpenAPI 3, we have better and newer JSON schema-ish, in a sense that we move from JSON schema draft 4 to JSON schema draft 5. And in both cases, in Swagger 2 and OpenAPI 3, there are some extra properties that were added by the specification. So basically now in OpenAPI 3, you can take advantage of the one-off, any-off, and not property that allows to combine different various JSON schema together, which is very useful. And there is also the write-only property that allows you to tell that this property is only used when on a write operation. There was read-only on the Swagger 2 version, but not the write-only. And with the combination of the two, it's really useful to describe a single schema that will be used both in reading and writing. That makes the specification more simpler to describe and more simpler to use. In 3.1, we jump to the latest version available, or at least the version what was available at the moment of the specification was released, so draft 2020-12, and icing on the cake, in OpenAPI 3.1, you can tell which version of JSON schema you use. So if you want to use older version, you can, but if a new version of JSON schema is released, you will be able to use it in your document by indicating in $schema the version you are actually using. Obviously, that means the parser you will use needs to manage that version. But that way, that makes the specification future-proof. So you can be sure that if you design your schema with a specific version of JSON schema, you put it in your spec and it will always work. And if newer versions arrive, you will be able to use them seamlessly. Another improvement regarding data is OpenAPI 3 as an enhanced management of content negotiation. So in Swagger 2, you could say that get/resource produce data which are in application/JSON or text/CSV. The problem is that you could define a single schema for both content type. With OpenAPI 3, the produces property has been removed, and now you define the content type of the response body or the request body inside a content property using specific keys like application JSON or text CSV. And so you can define a specific schema for each content type. That allows to have better definition of your API if you take advantage of this HTTP feature. Yet another improvement regarding data. You can now have a more, let's say, complete way of describing complex parameters or header, especially the serialization. In Swagger 2, you could say that, let's say, for instance, a query parameter was an array. And you could say, okay, this property will be represented as a CSV string, so value separated by string, or by multiple values, for instance, name equal value 1, name equal value 2, and so on. But nothing regarding objects. In OpenAPI 3, you can serialize objects and array in headers or query parameters using a combination of style and explode. And so you can virtually do whatever you want. Last but not least, regarding data in general, and more like here, the capability of describing your interface contract. In OpenAPI 3, you can describe, let's call them in a generic way, reverse APIs. Reverse APIs because these are APIs that are defined by the provider of the API that will be implemented by the consumer of the API and called by the provider. In 3.0, the callbacks were added. The callbacks are used, let's say you do post/resources, which is a long-running operation. And instead of letting consumer doing some polling, you want to provide a way to, as a consumer, tell the, as a provider, sorry, to tell the consumer that this long operation is done. And so you can describe that by adding a callback in your post/resource operation, describing the operation like any other one with a slash whatever. And it will be up to the consumer to implement that to receive the event of the termination of the long operation. In 3.1, webhooks were added. So callbacks are, the call of the callbacks are triggered by a first API call made by the consumer. With webhooks, the provider, from its own initiative, can send an event to the webhook that is implemented by the consumer. And to define a webhook, it's that simple. You define it just like you would define an operation. It's just marked as a webhook. And so that means, as a consumer of this API, you have to implement that. Let's talk about documentation now. One thing that I really like with OpenAPI 3, and not only because I was participating to this discussion in the beginning of OpenAPI 3, is that you can have multiple examples that are documented. In Swagger 2, you could have example only on response and request bodies, no example on headers and parameters. That was a real problem. And if you wanted to put examples on bodies that are requests or responses, you could only have one example. You can possibly use a trick by, let's say, cheating with content type, which is inside example, to put multiple examples, but it was not made for that, and the rendering and documentation is not really cool. In OpenAPI 3, you have example on parameters, response headers, request bodies, and response bodies. And you can have multiple examples. So each example is identified by a specific key. You can have a summary, a description, a value, or an external value. So instead of putting the data inside the document, which can be a problem sometimes with certain type of data, you can provide a URL that points to an example of documents. Not big improvement, but quite convenient. With OpenAPI 3, we had summary and descriptions added at the path level. So for /resources, I can put a summary and description, just like we had in operation. And with 3.1, a summary has been added in the information. That looks like it's not a big improvement, but having that summary, I've been working on API catalog for my previous company, and we wanted to have a short description of the API. And so we did something into the info description telling, okay, we will take the first sentence or all the words that are before a specific separator to make the short description. That was not really convenient. Having a dedicated summary, you can really have a really short description, which is different from the long description. And thinking about providing this short description can also help you designing your API, because if you are unable to describe it with a few words, maybe you have a design problem and you are not designing the right API. And so that way it's consistent all the way. We have summary and description at the API level, at the path level, and at the operation level. So I think it's time to say thank you and goodbye, Swagger 2. You can use OpenAPI free now and get all of its exclusive new features for free, or almost. Because let's talk for a few seconds about the path to OpenAPI free upgrade. The first thing you need to do if you are already using Swagger 2 is to check all the third-party tools you are using, open source tools, but more important, vendors tools, because open source tools are usually up to date and at least support OpenAPI free. But for vendor tools, sometimes they can take a very long time. I waited for 3 years that my API gateway vendor in my previous organization did the update. So check with them and don't hesitate to yell at them to gently tell them that it is time to upgrade to OpenAPI free and 3.1. Then you have to upgrade all your toolings. Usually you take advantage of open source parsers, so it should not be a big deal. And then you may convert your existing document. So no worries about that. Converting Swagger 2 document to OpenAPI free document is quite simple. There is no loss. And there are many tools. You can go check a website called openapi.tools that lists many tools that use OpenAPI, and there is a section regarding converters. Okay, so this is the end of this session, and I hope that now you will, if you are still using Swagger 2 and didn't knew what were the possibilities of OpenAPI free, you are convinced to make the jump, and your world will never be the same, to paraphrase the Sega advertisement.
Thank you very much, Arnaud. Again, awesome slides. Like a lot of work. I love the video games comparison. Just one quick question. So it seems we have to manage already like a lot of API versions, which are sometimes documented or not. Then OpenAPI definitions, right? About all these versions. And now there is also a version of versions, like the version of the spec we use, right? So do you see like how to manage this fragmentation of API version under API specification versions? It can be really complex. At some point, it would be like Android operating system. You have like 5-6 cohorts living in the same time. How can you manage that on a guidelines aspect?
You have to support multiple versions of the specification. That's mandatory. But you have to be careful to stick to the latest version as much as possible. And frankly, usually moving from an older version to a new version, you don't have loss. So it's not really a big deal. You can run a batch to upgrade everything. If you are using tools, you have to upgrade them. But really, it's at least support 2 versions and upgrade as fast as possible. There is no other way to deal with that. Do not wait for decades sticking with very old version, because you will not be able to take advantage of all the new features.
And would you agree with, let's say, this statement that when a new version comes, and let's say when you decide to adopt a new version, you should impose the fact that all new APIs must be under the latest version?
Yeah, I think that's a good practice to do that. But that means you have prior that you have upgraded all your tools, your CI/CD or whatever that take advantage of the specification to support the latest version.
So once you decided to go to 3.0 or 3.1, version 2 or the Swagger or whatever, the old one can still live. But let's say, sometimes some companies do no more investment in a version that is not on the latest.
Yeah. And then you can add rules if you are using tools such as Spectral, which is an OpenAPI linter. It can lint any other type of or JSON or YAML document, but you can add a new rules, which is in the beginning a warning. Warning, you are using a Swagger 2 specification. You have to move to another version. And then later, you can make it an error and block the deployment of the API, for instance.
Yeah, perfect, Arnaud. Thank you very much
Thank you
for that talk. Thank you for being there for these awesome slides.